To someone living just 5 years ago, it would have seemed unimaginable, like something out of a dystopia. On January the 9th of this year, Ecuadorian President Daniel Noboa declared that his country was in an internal armed conflict. Following a spate of prison breaks and brazen gang attacks that included the storming of a TV station live on air, the country is now under a state of emergency. A nighttime curfew keeps the streets deserted while the military is authorized to use lethal force. For Ecuadorians, the announcement must have seemed unreal. As recently as 2019, Ecuador was considered one of Latin America's safest spots, a sleepy, upper-middle-income nation of 18 million with a murder rate far lower than that of its neighbors. The sort of country for which descriptive words like Oasis are usually reserved. Well, not anymore. In the last half-decade, Ecuador has gone from being one of the continent's safest nations to one of its most dangerous. Gangs kill with impunity. Prisons are under the control of criminals. The once low homicide rate is higher than even that of Venezuela. So what caused this? What chain of events dragged sleepy Ecuador into a state of low-intensity warfare? Well, the answers are as complex as they are terrifying. In Ecuadorian history, January 2024 may come to be remembered as the month everything changed. Starting on Sunday the 7th, a series of jailbreaks, hostage takings, and gang attacks paralyzed the nation and sent the wider world into shock. Drug lords like Jose Adolfo Macias, better known as Pito, and his rival Fabricio Colón Pico vanished from prison. Bombs were set off at random in multiple cities. Policemen and prison guards were kidnapped or held at gunpoint, with video even circulating of one guard being lynched. In universities and hospitals, gunmen were reported trying to break in. The port city of Guayaquil saw 8 people murdered by gang members. But it's what happened at TC television that really caught the world's attention, that made everyone outside the country realize just how far into the abyss Ecuador had fallen. Live on air, young men wielding guns, grenades, and dynamite broke into a studio and took the crew and presenters hostage. For 15 minutes, terrified Ecuadorians watched as the gangs took over their TV screens. Although the police managed to retake the studio without a single fatality, the damage was done. As narco journalist Ian Grillo explained on Substack, quote, "The gangsters scored a victory with the raid by delivering a powerful psychological blow to the people of Ecuador watching it live. It was part of the propaganda war in Ecuador's gangster uprising." The quote ends. It's an uprising that, at the time of writing, is still ongoing. Just 1 week after the studio incident, the public prosecutor charged with uncovering who ordered the attack was shot and killed in broad daylight on his way to a court hearing. 4 days later, on January the 21st, 68 gunmen were arrested trying to storm a hospital in Yaguachi, Goiás. The papers, meanwhile, in the words of the Financial Times, quote, "are filled with political assassinations, prison riots, and gang shootouts." To this, we could add stories about the security services trying their best to launch a fight back. In this, they've been helped by their governments. On January the 8th, the new president, Daniel Noboa, instituted a state of emergency that allows for 60 days of curfews and the suspension of some civil liberties. The day after, following the raid on TC television, he declared an internal armed conflict, a move that allows the military to use lethal force. 22 of the country's gangs were reclassified as terrorist organizations, changing the status of their members from that of criminals to warring parties in a non-state conflict. Taking such a step was highly unusual. Generally, Latin American nations have been averse to label fights with cartels as wars due to the reputational damage that comes with it. Mexico, for example, is suffering a wave of violence comparable to many war zones, but officially, it remains at peace. As the blog Global Americans points out, though, an internal armed conflict is one of the only instances in which Ecuador's constitution allows for military actions against its citizens, even when those citizens are members of murderous gangs. And you had better believe that the army is making the most of those newfound powers. Since the chaos of early January, Quito has cracked down hard on crime groups. Over 1,000 gang members have been arrested. Most prisons that suffered inmate uprisings have been retaken, with nearly all those taken hostage being freed. Even foreign cartels have suffered. On January the 23rd, the leader of Colombia's Oliver Sinisterra, a dissident rebel group, was captured in Ecuador's north near the border. So ferocious has the government reaction been that the gangs appear to realize that they may have overstepped the mark here. While attacks related to the uprising continue, they do so at a far lower level than at the beginning of January. One escaped drug lord, Fabricio Colón Pico, even recorded a video offering to turn himself in if the government guaranteed his safety. President Noboa declined. The big question right now is how long will this chaos last? Security researcher Fernando Carrion told the Financial Times that Ecuador's gangs have about 50,000 members, many of them heavily armed. This compares to the 24,000 soldiers tasked with taking them down. Now, we'll circle back to what this means for Quito's chances of success later in the video, but before we get into that, we need to take a detour back in time to explain a fundamental part of this fight, a part without which none of this makes any sense. The part where we explain how Ecuador went from Oasis to ground zero for cartel violence in the first place. If you need an illustration of just how quickly Ecuador's crime got out of control, you could do a lot worse than looking at a graph of the nation's homicide rate per 100,000 people. Between 2015 and 2020, the line bumps along at a relatively low level, sometimes slightly higher than the murder rate of the United States, sometimes slightly lower, but always remaining below that of even other famously safe Latin American countries like Costa Rica. As recently as 2019, The Economist reports that Ecuador was one of the region's safest countries. A sleepy slice of mountain and coastline sandwiched between the far more troubled nations of Peru and Colombia. But then something happens, and the line begins to not just tick up, but blast off like a rocket. By 2022, Ecuador was reporting more murders than Mexico. By 2023, it was recording 45 homicides per 100,000 people, enough to make it the deadliest place in mainland Latin America. As the death toll has grown, that violence has become more audacious. In 2022, headless corpses were infamously found suspended from a bridge in the city of Esmeraldas, but other gang victims are known to have been decapitated or burned alive. As always, in these types of situations, the drivers behind such a sudden increase in brutality are myriad and they are complex. Broadly, though, they can be grouped into two categories: those driven by local factors and those driven by international ones, mostly linked to the cocaine trade. In this section, we're going to focus on the local factors, the ones that can be attributed to short-sighted thinking and corruption among Ecuadorian elites. Now, this rot likely began back during the presidency of left-wing populist Rafael Correa, who made thumbing his nose at the USA part of his act. Under his watch, cooperation with the DA was curtailed and elite police task forces set up with American help to combat drug crime were disbanded. But if Correa's actions were unhelpful, then those of his successor, Lenin Moreno, were nothing short of destructive. In part due to IMF pressure, Moreno froze the budget for the security services. He even abolished the Justice Ministry and took an axe to the prison's budget, decreasing it by 30%. Even prior to these cuts, Ecuador's prisons were overcrowded, underfunded, and crime-ridden hellholes. Since the Moreno administration, they've become effectively unmanageable. Up to a quarter were, until military raids this January, thought to be under control of the gangs. As a result, some of Ecuador's biggest prisons began acting not as places for punishment or rehabilitation, but as gang recruitment centers. Political scientist Luis Cordova described them to Deutsche Welle as, quote, strategic hubs for the planning and distribution of drugs. This is why a drug lord like Fito was able to walk out of prison on January the 7th, kick-starting Ecuador's wave of chaos. Rather than a place to hold him, the building was basically his office. More troubling have been the prisons where rival gangs control different areas. There, recent turf wars between outfits like Los Lobos and Los Cherneros have triggered vast and deadly riots. In one notable clash in 2021, 123 prisoners were murdered. It's no coincidence that some of the worst violence of the internal armed conflict has so far taken place in prisons. Of course, simply starving a prison system of funds does not automatically guarantee that gangs will take over that system. For criminal groups to be able to operate with such impunity, you need a corrupt local elite that's willing to help them. Ecuador has this corruption in spades. As recently as 2022, 25 Air Force officials were revealed to have taken bribes from gangs to destroy their own equipment. But it's those elites who featured in Caso Metastasis who may have the most to answer for. A sprawling investigation into corruption that unfolded in December, Metastasis saw the arrest of more than 30 people linked to organized crime. Among their number were judges responsible for sentencing drug lords, state prosecutors, police officers, and even the former director of the prison authority. It was this wave of arrests that some think may have triggered January's gang attacks. By putting pressure on the newly inaugurated Daniel Noboa, former Ecuadorian intelligence officers briefed the New York Times that Metastasis forced the president to announce measures like transferring drug lords to new maximum security facilities. Fearing the loss of their freedom, or perhaps their lives, guys like Fito instead vanished. A day after he did so, the country went up in flames. Still, we can't paint a full picture of Ecuador's descent just by looking at local issues, because there are powerful outside factors involved too, factors that all converge on a single product: cocaine. Bounded to the south and east by Peru and to the north by Colombia, Ecuador has the great misfortune to sit between the two biggest cocaine producers on the planet. Yet for a long time, the flow of drugs through this small South American country didn't spill over into widespread violence. The reason? The trade was monopolized by FARC. Colombia's largest left-wing rebel group, FARC was large, well-funded, efficient, and utterly in control of the local cocaine shipping routes. So long as the group was around, no other cartels saw a point in even trying to compete. As a result, violence linked to the trade was relatively low, and because violence was low, the Ecuadorian state rarely clashed with the guerrillas. Even after Colombian ports increased restrictions in 2009, the increase of blow moving through Ecuadorian alternatives brought few drastic changes. Up till 2015, it was legal to carry up to 50 grams of coke on you, and as recently as last year, police still couldn't do anything if they caught you carrying a gram. So, what changed? Well, it all started with a deal that seemed like a massive win for peace. In 2016, the Colombian state and FARC reached an agreement that saw the rebels end their 50-year war and lay down their arms. It was Colombia's biggest security win in decades. Sadly, in Ecuador, though, it would play out like a nightmare. The sudden disappearance of FARC left a power vacuum around cocaine shipping routes that were becoming ever more lucrative as global cocaine habits changed. Whereas for a long time the United States had been the biggest market for coke, that shifted around 2016, with Europe taking the lead. As Council on Foreign Relations fellow Will Freeman told Vox, that's made control of ports much more important. Obviously, you're not flying little planes from Colombia to France. With its lower security, use of the dollar, and lax visa requirements, Ecuador was the perfect place to start cashing in on this transatlantic boom. According to the Netherlands-based reporter Chris Dalby, the shipping route between Guayaquil to Antwerp in Belgium soon became the world's most lucrative drug route. This simple fact was all it took to start attracting drug gangs from across the world. With FARC gone, international organized crime, along with FARC dissidents who refused demobilization, rushed to fill the gap. Venezuelan gangs and the Albanian mafia both established footholds. But the biggest change was the arrival of Mexico's feared cartels. Over the last few years, the Sinaloa gang and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG, have taken root in Ecuador. Each sponsors a different local gang: Los Llaneros for Sinaloa and Los Lobos for CJNG. In exchange for access to cocaine and profits, the cartels have gifted their Ecuadorian counterparts with heavy weaponry they could have only dreamed of a decade ago. Weapons that almost allow them to match Ecuador's security forces in terms of firepower. Yet it's not just guns and bombs that the cartels exported, but also their model of violence. Colombian and Mexican cartels were among the first to pioneer intimidation through violence that is not just extreme, but almost baroque. So gruesome, so over the top that it's intended to cow entire nations. Those decapitated bodies found hanging from a bridge in Esmeraldas in 2022 were an importation of Mexican cartel practices to a country completely unprepared for them. In fact, you could say the same about the whole wave of violence that opened in 2024, that it was extreme not simply because the gang members are savages, but because they've seen the propaganda value of shock tactics. But look, we're getting ahead of ourselves, because the arrival of Mexican, Venezuelan, and Balkan crime gangs isn't the only factor in the recent upheavals. There's also the impact of local turf wars. 2020 was something of a boom time for Ecuador's gangs. As measures to combat the COVID pandemic pushed thousands of people into poverty, recruitment became easier than ever. But the year was also one of fracturing. In December, the leader of Los Llaneros, Jorge Luis Zambrano, better known by his nickname Rasquiña, was shot dead in a shopping center. It was this act that brought Fito to the top of the crime group, but it also acted as the opening salvo of what would become a vast gang war, a power struggle between the Llaneros and the Lobos, backed by the Tiburones and the Chone killers. Yet further, it was made all the worse by the participation of the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels. It was this gang war that drove much of Ecuador's elevated homicide rate in the early 2020s. Not only did the Lobos and Llaneros fight one another, they also fractured into splinter groups, which in turn fought amongst themselves. As Fernando Caron told the Financial Times, after Rasquiña was murdered, that's when these major disputes started taking place between the biggest criminal groups, and we started to see other groups join the fray. According to Insight Crime, the war only ended in 2023 with the victory of Los Lobos, a victory that saw them take control of major trafficking routes and ports and, in the think tank's words, become the engine of Ecuador's criminal machine. Not that this victory meant the total annihilation of their competitors. After all, it was Los Chaneros who ordered the high-profile assassination of presidential candidate Fernando Villavicencio in August of last year. It was also the escape of gang boss Fito from prison on January the 7th that sparked this recent explosion of violence. No, what the turf war did was ensure the fragmentation of the criminal scene in Ecuador, creating a situation similar to Mexico, where multiple groups are in a state of permanent competition with one another, a competition in which ruthlessness bestows an advantage. This means that there's likely no return to the pre-2016 days when FARC's near total monopoly kept violence on trafficking routes at an acceptable level. It also poses a problem for President Noboa's crackdown on the gangs. According to Insight Crime, the underlying competition between gangs makes fighting a war against them difficult, since any military operation that significantly weakens one gang can give another, even a previously small and insignificant one, a strategic advantage. We've seen this previously happen in Mexico, where the destruction of one cartel by the government can result not in peace, but in new rounds of mayhem as smaller gangs jostle for their former territory. The fear is that this might now happen in Ecuador. On the other hand, it's not like Quito can afford to just let the drug gangs keep running around loose, especially after the chaos they unleashed. With that in mind, it's time to leave the background explainer part of our video and turn instead toward the future. A future in which the gang crackdown could succeed, or could trigger yet another cycle of chaos. Right now, one of the most popular leaders in Latin America is Nayib Bukele, the young, crypto-loving president of El Salvador who mercilessly crushed his nation's gangs. For some watching Ecuador's struggles, the hope is that President Noboa can be the next Bukele. After all, both are young men elected on platforms that at least partially included breaking the stranglehold of crime groups. Both have called for purpose-built maximum security jails to house drug lords. Both have empowered the military, and both have redefined gang members as terrorists. But there are more differences between the two than there are similarities, the most important of which may be regarding political power. In El Salvador, Bukele dominates the entire political system. Congress is a rubber stamp body. The judiciary is packed with his people. So in control is Bukele that he was recently able to disregard the constitution's prohibition on running for a second consecutive term. Noboa, by contrast, came to power after his predecessor, Guillermo Lasso, stepped down early. In the Ecuadorian system, that means Noboa's mandate only covers the remainder of Lasso's term. This means he has to seek re-election in May of 2025. And while the Ecuadorian president wields significant power, he doesn't control the entire system. The 137-seat parliament is still a powerful body, one where Noboa's party holds a mere 14 seats. In short, Noboa is in a far more precarious position than the strongman in El Salvador, and he's facing a far more powerful threat. As we mentioned in our recent video on Bukele's war on gangs, El Salvador's crime groups may have been brutal, but they were also relatively small-time and localized. Their money came not from transnational cocaine shipping, but from extortion rackets and shakedowns. Ecuador's gangs, by contrast, are far better connected, far better armed, and far more sophisticated. They have multiple funding streams to fall back on if their drug routes are disrupted, and their backers in Mexico and Colombia give them access to weapons El Salvador's hoodlums could only dream of. That would make taking them on a challenge even for a rich state with a well-funded security apparatus, two things which unfortunately do not describe modern-day Ecuador. Quito's finances are in pretty rough shape. Not Venezuela bad, but also not good enough to fund an ongoing, extremely expensive military deployment. According to the country's Finance and Economic Ministry, about $1 billion extra are required to keep up the gang crackdown. Yet at the time of writing, Congress is refusing to raise taxes to fund the internal armed conflict. Now, that's not to say that the money is impossible to find. The US has already offered military aid, and both the European Union and Colombia are expected to chip in. Still, it illustrates one of the basic issues facing Noboa. He can't keep this crackdown up without a massive, ongoing injection of foreign aid. In this, he's been hindered by the lack of funding the security services have received over recent years. So pervasive has corruption been that the police force is lacking in manpower and equipment, including basic stuff like having enough vehicles. On top of that, there's the way cartels have infiltrated the nation's security apparatus. The US ambassador to Ecuador has accused top police officials of being on the gang's payroll. Insight Crime reports that drug lords have even used local cops as bodyguards. Given all that, It's perhaps understandable that many experts are skeptical that Noboa can defeat all the gangs once and for all. Indeed, while Bukele gained fame for a crackdown that seems to have worked, military responses to cartels historically fail in Latin America. Mexico and Honduras have both been going down that route for years, yet both continue to suffer sky-high homicide rates. Still, we should note that not all analysts worry Ecuador is doomed to failure. Writing in Global Americans, Latin American research professor at the US Army War College, R. Evan Ellis, argued that, quote, the temporary social and political consensus strengthened by the gang's latest overreach and the legal conditions created by the Noboa government response have arguably created the conditions for the government to achieve significant results. If that turns out to be the case, then it'll certainly be something to celebrate. Many parts of Latin America in recent years have repeated a depressingly similar story, one in which gang crime and homicides rise and the state seems powerless to do anything about it. To have Ecuador become a country that bucks that trend would be a ray of hope for millions across the region. Unfortunately, though, we wouldn't count on it. As we've seen in this video, the causes behind Ecuador's internal armed conflict are myriad. They are transnational, and they took root across multiple years. Years in which corruption became so pervasive and foreign cartels so entrenched that undoing all the damage could take the rest of the decade. So, as we finish for today, we'll do so with a prayer for Ecuador, a prayer that the rising tide of violence can be halted, that the country can regain the paradise it was just a few short years ago. Because the people living there, they deserve better than this. Better than a corrupt elite that's let them down and criminals who can operate with impunity. They deserve peace.